Right, thank you. Thank you for staying the course. Greetings to the folk in the UK. Lovely to see you. Now, remember I said in the introduction, sorry, there is one thing I must say. Load shedding is about to strike us at 8 o'clock. So I'll just switch over to my trusty lamp when that happens. So let's get underway before ESCOM strikes. Remember I said in the introduction that the book of Esther is a parody, and we're going to see plenty of that tonight. And we also saw in the introduction that the central character in the story isn't Esther, it's the king. The story hinges on various decrees issued by the king, and in fact, nothing happens without his consent. He appears by name or reference in every chapter. From the narrative's opening sentence, we learn he reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. So that's quite a large chunk of real estate. And the closing comment on him is, all the acts of his power and might, are they not recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? And these two statements about the king stand like bookends at the beginning and the end of the story. And they are the narrative's only concessions to the king's achievements. Even though history tells us that he accomplished great things, he's caricatured in Esther as an easily manipulated ruler. He's given to self-indulgence and sexual gratification. He regards his subjects as his property, existing only for his profit and pleasure. Young women are little more than frivolous collectibles for his harem, and the Jews are a mere inconvenience to be disposed of over a cocktail. So the depiction is of a powerful but changeable, very volatile, unapproachable, and sometimes cruel dictator. And the writer of Esther invites us to contrast this portrait with that of the all-powerful but unchanging, accessible and gracious King of Kings, the Lord himself. So even though God is never mentioned, you can't help but make the comparison between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man. So the story opens with King Ahasuerus displaying the glory of his kingdom, and very soon we learn about the irreversible decrees of the Medes and Persians. Among them, the decree that all women must be subservient to their husbands, and the decree to kill all the Jews in the empire. On those two decrees depends the entire story. So these decrees are written into law, and they are sealed with the king's ring and set in concrete, as it were. Now, law is a good thing. Law isn't a bad thing, but not when laws are used for the benefit of the privileged few. And the story of Esther demonstrates the abuse of law and the kinds of laws we find in the scroll of Esther and the stupidity of them. In fact, the Persians are law-bound in a way that's absurd. Events only become actualized once they're written into law and sealed with the king's ring. Vashti's refusal to come before the king must be reinforced by a written decree that she will never again come before the king. Male headship has to be propped up by a written law before men can rule in their own homes. Haman's hatred of the Jews only becomes a genuine threat once it's written into law. The Jews cannot defend themselves until permission to do so is written into law. So, as I said, things being written into law would be okay if they were good laws for the good of all, but not so in the case of King Ahasuerus's rule. And what's laughable is that throughout the story, the weighty decrees ruling Persian life are drawn up at the drop of a hat. So let's go back to the opening scene, where the king is hosting a banquet. It lasts all of 6 months, and this banquet, though, wasn't like some of our government's party bashes. This banquet wasn't all beer and pretzels. It was to plan strategy for a military campaign. We learn that from secular history. The Hebrew word for banquet is mishteh, which is derived from the word shatah, to drink. And if you read the account, you'll notice that while we're given a great deal of detail about wine and drinking goblets, there's no mention of food, not even a breadstick or a celery stalk. So this hints at the nature of the banquet. Now, a Greek historian, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Herodotus, a historian of the time, had this to say: the Persians are very fond of wine and drink it in large quantities. It is also their general practice to deliberate upon weighty affairs when they are drunk. And another Greek historian, I think these gentlemen might have been a bit biased, but Xenophon observed, they drink so much they cannot stand on their feet and must be carried out. So it was believed that intoxication put them in touch with the spiritual realm. Verse 7 tells us that the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king, and the guests could drink as much or as little as they wanted to. But when drinks are on the house, I'm willing to bet they didn't stop at one for the road. The emphasis was on gratifying fleshly desires. Ahasuerus wanted to win the support of these movers and shakers in his kingdom. So listen to verse 8. And drinking was according to the law. No one was compelled, for the king had given orders to all the officials of his palace to do as every man desired. You start to get the feeling that you've entered cloud cuckoo land. The drinking was according to the law, yet at the same time, it was as every man desired. So this gives us a clue that this is actually a kingdom of law and disorder. It's an upside down world where, according to the law, if you're in the elite classes, you can do as you please. So this hedonistic feast pandered to the will of the individual, not the good of the empire. What a contrast to the messianic feast that is to come, that we'll celebrate with Yeshua. Now, what happens next challenges the depiction of Ahasuerus, this all-powerful monarch of the ancient world's greatest superpower. And verses 10 to 12 set the stage for Esther to appear on the scene. Chapter 1, verse 10 tells us that the king called for Vashti on the 7th day when his heart was merry with wine. Now, there's a euphemism if ever there was one. So here we see a direct link between the king's intoxicated state and his impulsive summons to the queen to come display herself before these drunken oafs. And Matthew Henry writes in his commentary, he that had rule over 127 provinces had no rule over his own spirit. Vashti understandably refuses, and here's an irony if ever there was one. The king can show off his wealth, but he can't show off his wife. So he's fuming, as you can imagine. He's made to look stupid in front of his guests. So he immediately summons the experts in the law to find out what should be done with her. According to the law, here we go again. what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus, as if there were a specific law on the statute books dealing with rebellious queens. Now, here's a question. If he's so all-powerful, why didn't he put her to death? According to another historian, Josephus, strangers were not allowed to look on the beauty of Persian wives, of the ruling classes, which means the king himself violated protocol. No wonder he needs the experts in the law. He wants them to rubber stamp the idea that his drunken command can take precedence over established protocol. And that's why the king's advisors can cite no legal precedent against Vashti, but they have to concoct one. Because if she really broken the law, it would have been off with her head. So according to the royal advisors, her rebellion is culturally subversive and could incite all the wives in the empire to follow her example. And so an edict is issued banishing the queen. And when the king's decree shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives will give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. So Vashti's exercise of free will results in all women losing freedom of choice. And, such a decree is actually a tad ludicrous in a society where women are already disadvantaged. So the king sent letters to all the provinces, to every province in its own script and to every people in its own language, that every man be lord in his own house and speak according to the language of his people. But the laugh is really on the king. Every wife must obey her husband, while the king can't get his own wife to listen to him. And what's more, every man will speak the language of his people. The wives must speak to the husbands in the husband's language and not the other way around. But in order to write the letters, the king has to behave exactly as the wives do, because he has to write to every husband in his own language, whereas he can't use his language. So in this upside-down world, even the most insignificant husband will be empowered to do what the king can't do. And Harper's Bible commentary writes, the histrionic reaction of the king and his counselors involves the whole elaborate machinery of Persian law and administration, to say nothing of the postal service, in asserting the right of every man in the empire to be master in his own house. And it is implied that the story of Vashti's independence will spread like wildfire throughout Persian lands, every wife in the empire waiting only for the sign from the empress to break out in long stifled rebellion against her husband. Well, the irony is that the rulers in the home needed a law to be rulers in their own homes, as if earning respect could be legislated. Now, give them their due, the royal advisors had been trying to protect the king's honor. But look at the way they do it, by sending letters throughout the entire empire, advertising his humiliation. They make it public, which sort of defeats the purpose. Another irony, and this time a sad one, is that the ruling classes, the ones most concerned about honor, behave in a manner that is shameful. And the author of Esther draws a straight line between the disenfranchising of women and the later planned eradication of the Jews. Now, why? What's the connection? Because if you set a precedent in law, making one group of people inferior, then you can deal with any problem group in the same way. But as we've seen in previous sessions, it's one of the book's satirical reversals that Esther, who is both a Jew and a woman, will later work within the system to subvert the system and to save her people. She will, in fact, twice disobey one of the king's unalterable decrees by entering his presence without permission, yet be offered half the kingdom and become more powerful and influential than the first queen, who was deposed because of her disobedience. So the laugh is definitely on the king and his merry men, but let's not jump the gun. Look what happens after Vashti is deposed. It seems the king regretted his rash decision, so a certain group came up with an idea to cheer him up. And the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king choose officers in all of the provinces of his kingdom, so that they may gather together every beautiful young virgin to Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." Now, your version might say the king's servants, but the Hebrew word translated servants is na'arim, which literally means youths. The English Standard Version gets it right, and the king's mature advisors are nowhere to be seen. Instead, the ones who come up with a plan for selecting the new queen are a bunch of boys, and their standards aren't exactly high. There are only 3 requirements. The young woman must be a virgin. As I said, she must be young and she must be beautiful. And this is the lucky candidate who will be sent to the king for a trial run. He will then select the young woman who pleases him most. And I love the way a certain Bible teacher, Donald Curtis, put it. What a prospect for a parent or daughter, a year's preparation for one night with a stud king, then isolation in the concubine harem. And this is the spirit that permeates the Esther narrative. Spiritual and moral values are thrust into the background, while natural attributes such as political power, riches, physical appearance, lust, and of course chance or fortune dictate the flow of history. The kingdom of Ahasuerus is based on dat, B-A-T. That's a Persian loan word which means custom or protocol. It occurs 25 times in scripture, 20 of which are found in Esther. And on each occasion, it relates to the laws of the Medes and Persians. Now, with so much law, a superficial glance could lead us to believe that the empire is running like clockwork, but it seems more like Alice in Wonderland. It was, I think it was Napoleon who allegedly said, "In politics, absurdity is not a handicap." And the writer of Esther pokes fun at these laws. So just to recap, sorry, if you can put on your mute, there's a noise coming through. Ruth, I think it might be you. The first law mentioned in the story regulates drinking, but it allows indulgence. The second law disempowers women, but throughout the narrative, it's actually women who have quite a bit of say. Vashti, Esther herself, and Haman's wife Zeresh. The great ruler of 127 provinces can't even get his own wife to obey him, and he almost never makes a decision on his own. He never says no to any of his advisors. Everyone around him manipulates him. First, it's his royal advisors, whose spokesman was Memucan, and so he did according to the word of Memucan. Next, Haman influences him with a bribe, and so he decrees according to all that Haman had commanded. Then Mordecai gains his favor, and so he orders according to all that Mordecai commanded. So who's the boss? Even Esther obeys Mordecai rather than the king, and the king himself obeys his serving boys. So look at what these laws are based on. Is it righteousness? Forget it. The king is angry with Vashti, so the counselors get him to issue a decree because they don't like Vashti. She has too much influence. Haman is angry with Mordecai, so he gets the king to issue a decree by sweetening it with a bribe. Later on, the king is angry with Haman, so Esther gets him to issue a decree. Memucan appeals to the king's vanity and insecurity, and Haman appeals to the king's avarice. None of it is based on truth and justice, but on the capricious whims of those in power. So dat, that word, dat is invoked by the strong to disempower the weak. In the first case, women who are already disadvantaged, and in the second case, Jews who are a minority. So much for the kingdom of law and order. But when it comes to determining the date of a monstrous bloodbath, it's not dat or fixed protocol that prevails, but pur, the random casting of lots. And it's significant that Haman cast lots, or Purim, which is where we get the name of the festival. Purim is the plural of Pur. He casts lots to determine a date to kill the Jews. His belief system ascribed it to fate. And yet in real terms, the casting of Pur is random. So there's a great deal of absurdity in the story between the weight and inflexibility of Persian law and the nonchalant way the king issues decrees. He doesn't even bother to find out which ethnic group it is that he's condemned to death. Remember what Haman said to him? There are a certain people, doesn't identify them. The king was meticulous in investigating what should be done with Vashti, but now he's willing to permit the wholesale slaughter of an unnamed people on Haman's word alone. So what has happened to the mighty monarch? Back at the banquet, he'd instructed his guest to drink as each one desires. Haman is now given free rein to do with the Jews as seems good to you. In chapter 5, verse 5, he commands Haman to do as Esther desires. And he later tells Esther, after the Jews have won their victory, to write as she pleases. Who is really king? And soon the terrible edict is published and sent to all levels of provincial authority, the satraps, the governors, and the nobles. And the author of Esther describes the ensuing chain reaction with superb irony. 3 million people are condemned to death. The citizens receive the dreadful news. The whole city is thrown into confusion, and the king and Haman sit down to drink. Haman incited the king against the Jews by pointing to their alien customs. And when we refuse to follow the ungodly ways of the world, will earn its hatred. Haman manipulated Dut, man-made laws designed to serve the privileged classes. But his own belief system was based on poor, superstition, and fate. In the end, however, it was God's faithfulness to Torah, divine laws designed for the benefit of all humankind, and in which his covenant with the Jewish people was incorporated. It was Torah that prevailed and saved the day for the Jewish people. So how thankful we can be that, unlike Persia's fickle king, the heavenly king's laws stand forever, and they are just, and they are true, and they are good. Political systems might rise and fall, but Yeshua is the same yesterday, today, and forever. We can utterly depend on him, and God's kingdom will endure forever. And so we can take courage no matter what lawlessness we see going on around us. So that's the conclusion, and I just want to say thank you to all of you who've unrolled the scroll with me for these past 4 weeks. We've reached the end. So shall we open this up for